12th to order. First item on the agenda would be review and approval of minutes dated November 14th, 2011.
Move to approve, Brown.
Second, Aguilar.
Any comments? No? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
That is passed 4-0. The next item will be an update on the alarm ordinance. With that, we have communication from Chief Bartell that he would like to have this deferred until the January PCS meeting. Do we need any motions on that? Okay. That has been deferred for quite a while now, and Chief Bartell does have some new information on that. Next on the agenda would be review of the naming rights ordinance by Darren Smith.
Good evening, Darren Smith, Director of Community Development. One of the things I'm going to do real quick here is give a brief handout. I know the current ordinance 2-70 and 2-71 you do have, and that was made available in advance. But I also found a couple other things in the meantime I wanted to share, and we'll go into these in a moment. As we've been working on management agreements this past year of different public facilities and learning as much as we can about naming rights in general with this proposed and now approved event center, we want to make sure that we were familiar with our own naming ordinances. So in reviewing those, the ones that we have in place today, honestly, we felt like this ordinance raises just as many questions, if not more, than it actually answers, and just really felt like it begged clarification at a minimum, maybe overhaul. I think that's a policy decision for the council to make. Again, the ordinance you have in front of you, Section 270 and 271 of the city's ordinances, today is simply intended to briefly review this ordinance and raise some of the concerns and issues for possible discussion and amendment. If I could, jumping into those, just to give you an idea of some of the things that, as I read this, give me a little concern. In the first section there, under 270, it talks about the current ordinance specifically applies to city-owned buildings with, quote, civic, cultural, and recreational purposes, unquote. Well, that's fairly broad, but just as an example of a perhaps minor language change that could be suggested, why wouldn't we just simply make reference to all city-owned buildings? You know, why go into greater detail with this civic, cultural, recreational thing, which then could lead to subjectivity, and that means different things to different people. Another example would be the fact that it does refer to city-owned building, and that's it. So does that mean the skin on the building, the name on the outside of the building? What about everything inside? And my experience the last few months in kind of asking staff or others to read this and get their interpretation is, if you'd show this ordinance, which is very brief, to 10 people and ask them to read it, you get about 4 that say, oh, I think it's just the outside of the building. You get 4 that would say, no, I think it'd be everything. And then you get a couple that say, you know, I'm not sure after reading this. So again, that's where I think some of the clarity comes in. I guess some of the feeling with this is the fact is this naming ordinance does apply to city-owned facilities. Those are owned by taxpayers. I think most of us feel that taxpayers should have some say in the naming and selling of those facilities. So how do you get 156,000 plus citizens to have a say in something? Well, you do that through the city council, as you know. You are the 156 or 57,000 citizens. You speak for them. The public and taxpayers deserve to know the terms of these transactions. How else do we know how much the name on a building or an internal room or a garbage can or you name it inside a facility, a public asset, large or small? How do we know how much it was sold for? How do we know what was given, what was received in the terms of that agreement? How do we know the public received fair value in any of those transactions? Another thing I would say is some deals we found here and in other places have been done in perpetuity. For those who know a little bit about naming rights and those types of things, that is never a good idea. You never want to sell something in perpetuity, which basically means you've put an organization or a person's name on something forever. All deals, in my opinion, should be done in writing. I think that should be standard operating procedure. Today we don't know that that's being done. How do we know that these different deals that have taken place or could take place, how do we know that they're in writing and that they're being adequately written? The truth is, if it's with some of the public facilities we have, publicly owned facilities that are managed by third parties, if those third parties ever go away, ultimately it would be the city, potentially, that would be left to honor any agreements that are made, and that would be a legal matter, and the type of legal matter, obviously, we'd all like to avoid. Some things I'd like to pose to this committee: how far-reaching should this effort go? Right now, we're just talking about naming of public facilities in this ordinance, but what about even anonymous gifts that propose to alter a public facility or to construct an exhibit, for example, inside of a public facility? What should the public's right to know be with those? The City Council, in my opinion, should ultimately be the check and balance in this process on behalf of taxpayers. When you think about naming facilities, we can think of long lists of names that we would all agree would be perfectly appropriate. But there's also names that we can think of that someone might think is perfectly appropriate and a slam dunk, and others would say no, they're very polarizing, or as an organization or an individual. So again, who ultimately gets to say if somebody's name goes on a public asset? The last thing I would say is the zoo, the pavilion, some of these folks, Pavilion Management Inc., we have managing our facilities. They're doing very good things. They're very well intentioned, and we need to have them involved in these conversations at some point. They need to know that we are taking a look at this. We need their input and feedback, and then there needs to be that balance between letting them do the best job they can, but again, how do we protect city assets, make sure taxpayers are represented, and so forth. I guess Committee Chair Anderson, what I would propose is we would like to solicit information, suggestions, feedback from the committee members. What do you think some of these language changes could be? How far do you want the reach of this effort or the scope to go? As I mentioned earlier, if we could get some of that from your committee, then we could work with the city attorney's office to draft possible amendments, if any, and then we could just continue to go through the process. Also, in the handout I gave you on the last page, this is language that we've come up with that we would propose. You all know that the Pavilion Management Agreement we're working on right now, it's not finished. It's going very well. I think we'll be finished soon. But this topic is one that has come up in those agreement discussions. It is new in the agreement, and the language I put in front of you is what we have been discussing with Larry Toll and the others at the Pavilion. So it's not final, and nobody's agreed to anything, and it hasn't been approved, obviously, by you. But I just want to give you a sense of the way we've proposed to write this, to address it, to protect going forward, that the City Council, on behalf of taxpayers, always has the ability to approve of any names on anything inside or out. And perhaps that can provide some ideas or motivation for ideas from you folks for other parts of the arena, or I'm sorry, the ordinance. We would like to, I'll speak for myself, I guess. I would like to see if we can have a somewhat aggressive timeline on this. This is a brief ordinance. The other reason I say that is because with the Pavilion agreement that we are working on, and Don Kearney just finished working on the zoo agreement, and there are probably others this would impact, it would be nice going forward to have simple universal language in these agreements that just say you must comply with all city ordinances, for example, and then we know that naming rights is addressed in city ordinance, and we don't end up with different language in different public facility management agreements. And with that, I would close.
Okay. Councilman Brown?
Thanks, Darren. A couple of thoughts. Have we looked at what other cities are doing for some best practices so we don't have to start from scratch?
Yes, we are doing that. Yes, and Karen Leonard is working with me on this. Oh, Karen, there she is in the back. Karen and I are working on this, and that is one of the things that we're doing.
I think that would be
Yes.
a big help. And then I just need a clarification in terms of like the pavilion, and I'm just thinking out loud here, but I certainly understand with the permanent structure,
Yeah.
any physical changes made to the building, but in terms of exhibits,
Yeah.
I hope we're not controlling it at that level.
Well, that'll be for you folks to decide, and I think part of this was, for me, it probably started with, there just needs to be some clarity in here with some things on the inside or outside. Now, what that ends up being, again, is ultimately up to you folks. But I just found that this ordinance, does seem to be very gray in some areas. And frankly, I think for the management companies too, they'll come to us from time to time and say, we're thinking about this. What do you think? Is this something we need to be involved with together, or can we just go do this? I think if we had some clarity in here, it would be good for us, it would be good for them, and then everybody would kind of know what the deal is on these.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the committee? Councilwoman Offenbach?
I'm just looking at this list again, and again, I don't have anything concrete for you, Darren. I appreciate you just letting us kind of spin a little bit. Question about the list of names that is in the existing ordinance.
Yeah.
The zoo is not in that list.
Well, this was
Great.
one other note I made, and I didn't mention that, but again, I would propose to take the list out. Why have a list? Because then it gives the impression it's an all-inclusive list, and even though it says it's not, I don't know why you would write it this way.
Well, and I'm looking at, one of the people that's here today is from the Mary Jo Wagner Arboretum.
Yep.
That beautiful gem of a park has that wonderful name, based on a huge gift and from a wonderful family. Then are we going to control how we name the buildings that are built inside that park? I mean, there's all kinds of...
Yeah. Well, I think it's a good discussion to have. I really do. I think the timing is right. Again, with the zoo and the pavilion agreements in place or close to being in place, then you have this new event center and the whole, there are issues that raises. I just think it's a good time to have the discussion. The other item, again, I didn't want to go into a lot of different detail here. We can get to that. But, how are the funds? How much say does the city council want, or the administration for that matter, in how the funds are utilized? So let's say a room in a building or a building is sold. The naming rights are sold. What becomes of those funds? Should a private third-party management firm, no matter how well-intentioned, should they get to utilize those funds for their operating budget? Should those funds go back into the building? That was the asset that was just sold to generate those funds. Those are the kinds of conversations, I think, and questions that I think taxpayers would maybe raise. Hey, we built that facility. We paid for it. If a name was put on a room for $250,000, why is that going to, offset the debt or go towards operating budget things for a third-party firm? Why shouldn't that be earmarked to go back into the building and improve that public facility that we paid for and was sold?
Councilman Brown?
So, Darren, is it your intent by our next meeting to have some sort of a draft before us that we
Yeah.
can sort of work off of then?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. That's what I'd
Possible,
like to
can
do.
we get it well in advance of the meeting so we can be thinking about
Oh,
it?
absolutely.
And-
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep.
Councilwoman Aguilar?
Yes, well, I just wanted to give a little input. I do agree with you, Darren, that it should be any city-owned building and take out the list. And then I would like to see some checks and balances as far as maybe some approval at a certain level.
Yep. Yeah, I think that'll be, again, as I've kind of thought through this, I think the issue you raised, the issue Councilman Brown raised, that's what'll be interesting and fun about this, is where do you put those checks and balances in place that I don't think are entirely there today, but yet, how do you do that in balance with the management firms that we've hired to run these facilities? We trust them, they're doing a good job, and yet they are public facilities that people are being welcomed into. So how do you find that? And yet you don't want to be, for example, the other ordinance I attached, Section 2-90, the placement of statues, monuments, and memorials. You don't want to be approving the hanging of every piece of art. So how do we balance that? Because ordinances and laws are very difficult because they're very black and white. So how do you write it appropriately, but yet not tie everybody's hands too? So that's our challenge. So with feedback from your group, I'll send an email out to solicit that as a reminder, and then with feedback on what maybe some language changes you would suggest, or even just philosophically, this is what I think we should try and do here. I don't have any specific language suggestions, but here's what I think we should try and do. That would be very helpful for the city attorney's office and myself as well.
Councilor from High?
Another thing to think of, and I'm not sure that I have my history correct, but the city owns Great Bear Recreation Park as a city park now, but did it not come into our system as originally it was privately owned?
Yeah, that's my understanding.
And it's run by, it's got kind of an oversight board and all those kinds of things. I mean, do we treat that kind of facility, because it's not the only one, do we treat that kind of facility differently? That's going to be something that I'm going to stumble on when I'm reading through whatever we end up with, is that, wow,
Right.
How come you picked something this hard?
It just happened.
As you
Good luck with that, hon.
This gives us something to do over Christmas and the winter here.
And
This
you
is
can
fun.
expand that too to our golf courses.
Yeah.
Even some of our other park facilities that maybe not managed by another third party, but utilized by a third party, your soccer, your baseball, your associations, who also donate large amounts of money for upgrades to the areas that they utilize. So, Darren, you and I have spoken on this several times, and I think you know where my feelings are on this. I think that this is something we need to take a real hard look at, and we'll be looking forward to your revisions on this.
Okay, very good.
So any other comments or questions? Any comments or questions from staff or public?
Just a quick comment, Mike Cooper, Planning and Building Services. I think, Darren, if I was one of the 10 people that you quizzed about the original ordinance, I think in 1997 the intent was the name of the building. But I agree that it needs to be updated because there's been so many questions over the years about spaces within the building, rooms, whatever it might be. If somebody wants to recognize a citizen that has no monetary value associated with it, how would we deal with that? Like a Kenny Anderson Community Center, when we're trying to recognize, unique citizens within the community. We have been asked about that recently. And then recognition plaques within the building. Again, that level of detail, you can really begin to appreciate all the different issues that we have to deal with throughout the year. So I think it's a good process. I think also, what's the authority of the Park and Recreation Board by state law and by city ordinance? So again, how do all these different entities and facilities weigh in on making these kind of decisions? So I appreciate Darren volunteering to help lead this process with all of us, because it is time to take a look at it.
City Attorney?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would suggest, since we're dealing with a topic that could affect ultimately millions of dollars, I would like to take it a little bit slower. And what I would propose is, can we find some examples of some other legislation for you so you can look at that for your January meeting? I would not want to put any legislation out yet till we kind of have another discussion so we know what your thoughts are, what you like about, say, what the city of Lincoln, Nebraska is doing, or St. Paul, or someone else, before we go putting pen to paper. And I think that would be a very important process for this group to go through, and it would really help the attorney's office to know exactly what your wishes are so we can put pen to paper after we've clarified what those issues are. So.
I actually had that in my notes to ask the city clerk's office to look up ordinances from several different other communities that we normally look at. So I think we're on the same boat there. Is there any other comments from the committee?
So Mr. Chairman, just to clarify, we would not come forward with proposed legislation for the January meeting, but we just have examples of other legislation.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay, moving forward, I don't think we need to vote on this, or we'll just table this until next month. Next would be a review of the ordinance of the City of Sioux Falls, amending the revised ordinances of the city by revising Chapter 2, Administration, to change the day of when the council meetings are held. That'll be, we'll start with our city attorney, David.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dave Feifley with the City Attorney's Office. At the council's direction, we've been looking at a possible day change in meetings from a Monday to a Tuesday night. And I want to thank Sue Roust and her team at the clerk's office for their valuable insight and review of some possible revisions. And this would be in Chapter 2 on council procedures. And before I go through what's been attached to the folder, and in terms of the actual revisions, I think a lot of the comments from that will probably be answered by going through the language at a high level. But just from a 30,000-foot level, the concern was basically the way we do the agenda now, in terms of we have a Monday at 10 a.m. deadline, and that is for the following Monday's meeting. And I think there's been certainly an expression from many of the council that perhaps this deadline needs to be tweaked. Perhaps we can do something to reflect the modern era, the fast pace of city government. We're a city of 160,000 people. We move at a very fast pace. I've been acting as a city attorney for the city of Pierre. It was actually one of my first clients back almost 2 decades ago, and at 13,000 people, that city moved fast enough. You can't imagine what 160,000 people and all the issues we have. But, and also looking at how to get that rigidity changed on how to get items on the agenda, and also coupling it with what the 24-hour notice law is under state law. And for the public, by state law, we're required to post an agenda at least 24 hours in advance. If you have a meeting on Monday night, you are in essence you are in essence making your deadline for posting an agenda the Friday by the close of business if you're going to have a Monday night meeting. And all of our agenda deadlines were based on the fact that we were losing 2 days a week by having it on a Monday instead of another day of the week. Now, I know there are some concerns, and to present both sides of the issue, there are some concerns about conflicts with schedules, and certainly you folks can understand that more than anybody. You are elected. Lots of your time is basically taken up by council business. We've heard so many discussions about how much time each of you are spending, and I know the citizens appreciate it, but also staff are doing the same thing. And we're here at night, we're taking time away from our families and other important issues, and I know there's been some concerns expressed by at least some of the directors that as you go forward in the week that you're conflicting with more and more school events, and they're afraid they may miss more of their children's activities, and I wanted to just make that clear. Frankly, personally, my son had some flag football games that he was every Monday night, and I missed a great majority of them. But the nice thing for at least us, from my personal opinion, is I can get someone else to fill in if it's that important. Ultimately, it's going to be up to the 9 elected officials to decide when the meeting night should be. By charter, you're allowed to pick what your meeting day is. and you're to designate a regular monthly meeting. I guess the goals and or advantages in trying to go with a Tuesday night meeting would be, again, to take advantage of that 24-hour notice requirement. So if something happens during the rest of the week, and maybe even into the weekend, but probably more likely the later end of the week, we could take advantage of the 24-hour notice only and be able to revise our agenda. Right now, there's no way we can really do that except by a vote of 6 counselors to walk something in. We're not providing enough notice to the public that way, and plus, we're not really taking advantage of the 24-hour notice provision. I remember when I was starting out in Pierre, the city finance officer basically would post the agenda on the bulletin board at City Hall. And one time he had to revise it, and we had our meetings on Tuesday nights. He just took it up Monday, typed in a new item that we had to add to the agenda, called the Capital Journal quick, and I think he might have had 1 or 2 citizens that wanted notice. He provided that. It just seemed so simple. He actually just took a tack, took one down, put another one up, and just marked down it revised and let everyone who wanted notice know. And it just seemed like such a much more simple process than the way we go through things. Also, what's driving this, I think, is the flexibility now that the council's taken on contract approval. You've heard, through the fiscal committee, lots of testimony as far as trying to get contracts through, get them rewarded within 30 days, and all the issues that were coming up with that. Certainly with contracts were coming up after that Monday 10 a.m. deadline. And so again, I think this was to try and revise and address those concerns. Going through what's in your packet attached to it, starting with section 2-3, oh, I'm sorry, let me take that back. Briefly, from what I understand, city commission meetings used to be on Tuesday mornings. And what happened was, over time, is a lot of citizens were working days, and they were concerned as a commission that citizens weren't having a chance to offer their input and to attend council commission meetings at that time. And they were moved to the evenings in order to accommodate the citizens, certainly not to accommodate the commissioners' schedules. And I think what we've seen now is that certainly people in this town are working all different kinds of schedules. And I would implore you to look at maybe changing not just a day, but maybe a time of when meetings take place. I think technology has been such, too, that people are able to watch meetings live on the web, and certainly if they have an issue they want to come and address, I think they could still make a council meeting, but if they just want to attend and watch, they have other meaningful ways to look and watch the meeting without having to take time off from work if they work a specific schedule. And I'm sure, the good employers of Sioux Falls would probably grant their workers a chance to come to the council meeting if they need to say something at public input or if they have an item on the agenda. So I would just implore you to perhaps look at changing the time of when the meetings take place. But briefly, section 2-3, we're just going through changing it from Monday to Tuesday pursuant to your direction. And in 2.5, again, by changing council meeting time, we're changing the informational time as the proposal also to Tuesdays as well. Section 2-7, there, with the input from the clerk's office, what we're doing is we're taking away the requirement that the clerks keep minutes of executive sessions. Those aren't required by law. Generally, they're not really taking much of anything for notes in that other than basically what we're putting out now. But they just, since the clerks are not attending those meetings, they felt very uncomfortable trying to say they would keep track of the minutes. So I think in the future it would be far easier if we just reflect that you went into executive session for a proper purpose, move to adjourn at a certain time, or go out of exec session and back into regular session, as the case may be. Section 2-8, this isn't reflected in your notes, but to give you a heads up, journal and Part A, that's the old vernacular. Now everyone calls it minutes. State statute calls it minutes. The charter actually still calls it journal. That's why it has remained that way. As you're aware, the Charter Revision Commission is meeting. And I'm going to make a suggestion to them that one of the things they change is that we change it from journal to minutes to just properly reflect what's actually done. Back when I worked for the legislature about 20 years ago, they called it the Journal of the House, Journal of the Senate, and it kept track of the votes, and it was a very abbreviated minutes. It wasn't the true minutes of their meetings. And it's just not done anymore. That's the old way of doing it. Now we keep minutes. We have to post them within 10 days, and then you approve them at your next meeting. And they're all very public now, so the journal requirement is probably something of an anachronism from another era when we didn't have the electronic age, where items were posted on the website and proposed minutes were already there for citizens to review well in advance of the meeting, and probably they're getting them about the same time you are in terms of being able to review them. So that probably needs to come. Section 2.9, again, it's just reflecting if you change the meeting date to Tuesday, the election of the council chair and vice chair would occur on that meeting on the Tuesday rather than a Monday. Section 2.9, subpart D, strikes out, and shall serve as the parliamentarian for meeting of the city council, and that's a city clerk function that was placed in at the last revision. In talking with interim city clerk Roust and I, we both agreed that under Robert's Rules of Order, the presiding officer makes the determination of what the procedures are, but the governing body can override that with a majority vote. And the way it works in practice is the mayor is usually looking at the clerk who's here, but also the city attorney. Why do we need to put it in ordinance? Let's just keep that practice going of a collaborative effort, but ultimately recognizing that either the mayor or the majority of the rest of the council would decide what the actual procedure is. Section 2-14, subpart 5, at little f, adds another subject line for items under the consent agenda. This is at the request of the clerk's office. Sometimes we have items that need to go on the consent agenda that just don't fit in any of the other categories. And I know sometimes the consent agenda, Roberts calls it the consent calendar, the topics that can go under that have been expanding over the years. And as you've seen with some of the liquor licensing items, it's been a recent change in state law that Lori Hogstead, our licensing specialist, is now able to put some of those things on the consent agenda. So that's what that would do. The meat of the changes are in section 2-15. And again, this is all at the suggestion of interim clerk Sue Roust as well as her team in terms of the timing, what they could work with, and how if we changed it to a Tuesday meeting. We wanted to make it workable for the clerk's office, but yet provide that flexibility and understanding that some items are going to come in beyond a 10 a.m. deadline on Monday, or if we change it to a Tuesday, beyond 10 a.m. on a Tuesday. How do we make it so that the clerks can get their job done in a timely manner, are not hurried to an overwhelming extent, yet understand that sometimes things do happen at the last minute? Subpart A is just talking about, basically, we would change it to 2 p.m. on Tuesday, and Sue has a chart that she's prepared that really sets this out far better. If she could put that up. Sorry, Mr. Chairman. Things happen at the last minute. Okay. There we go. Hey. Seems to be lighting's getting better. Nope. Again, I want to thank Sue and her team. They put together this timeline based on the language in Section 215, and it's probably easier to look at the timeline for all the visual learners than trying to go through the verbiage in Section 2-15. But basically, by changing the meeting time to Tuesday evening, the deadlines would change as follows. You'd have a Tuesday at 2 p.m. deadline for items to go on the agenda for the next Tuesday meeting. Wednesday at 2 p.m. would be a deadline for items forwarded from council committees. And again, thanks to Sue and her team, we noticed that if items were passing out of a council committee, say on a Monday night, they were past the deadline in terms of the Monday 10 a.m. deadline to appear the next week. So it seemed only proper to make it so that a committee of the council could place an item on the agenda if it forwarded it, and be able to do that by Wednesday, 2 p.m. in time to make the next Tuesday meeting. Thursday at noon would become the deadline for contract change order listings for the consent agenda. Right now, we've been trying to work on making that deadline a little beyond the Monday at 10, but obviously contracts happen all during any given week. This would allow a lot more flexibility. Thursday at 3 p.m., an electronic agenda would be emailed to the council, the mayor, and all the directors. Under the current language, it's Wednesdays, and it would go to the council, the mayor, and the city attorney. And we've just made it to all the city directors, so everyone kind of has a draft of what the proposed agenda would be. And it goes to the public. Yes, thanks, Sue. Yeah, it goes to the public Wednesday afternoon as well. So in essence, it becomes your set agenda 5 days in advance. So it really doesn't give us any time to try and revise the agenda, add to it. If items come up after Monday at 10 a.m., there's really, other than a walk-in with 6 votes, there's no other way to get an item on the agenda. Fridays would be a agenda review meeting. They currently happen on Thursdays. Friday by 5 o'clock, the agenda and attachments would be placed on the SIRE system, and in other words, they're going out to the public and to those who on the website, and are also going to those who've requested notice under pursuant to state law. And that way, the public is still getting it 4 days in advance of your meeting, which is probably more notice than probably anywhere else in the state that I'm familiar with. Monday at noon would become a deadline. These are all proposals again. It's up to you, good folks, on how you want to handle it. But this is suggestions from the clerk's office working along with our office, that Monday at noon would be a deadline for agenda additions. There are obviously some rules regarding Monday holidays and the like. What's interesting to note is if you would add an agenda item after the normal date and try and add one on, say, Monday by noon, I placed some language in there that would require that item before it would be acted upon to be voted upon separately to be approved on the agenda, to provide some check by the council so that people wouldn't be waiting around, well, I know I didn't quite make the Tuesday the week before deadline or the Thursday deadline, but I can sneak it on Monday and it's not a big deal. Well, this kind of provides a bit of a check for the council that they can make sure that if it is an addition after the normal deadlines, you're going to have to get approval from a majority of the councilors present at the meeting that night. I guess a question that Sue Roust and I would have certainly are red notes, and I'll let Sue talk about that. And it allows for email notice of any agenda additions to the public, posted on the website. And certainly, any folks who need that notice would be allowed. Now, back on Section 215, Subpart B, it allows that on the request of any one council member for items you're placing on the consent agenda, any one council member can take an item off. And in reviewing dozens of other bodies around the country in terms of what they were doing. The common thread was that any one member of that body could remove something from the consent agenda, but we wanted to make sure that this wasn't done just to ask a couple questions. It could be asked, say, directly from that council member calling the sponsor of that legislation rather than just taking something off of the consent agenda. So hopefully that will find a good compromise for that. Section 216, subpart A, something I added just to reflect what's done in practice during public input. If it's an item that's on the agenda later that night where public input will be allowed, it's now by ordinance that you should wait till that item's up on the agenda. Also just places an ordinance that during public input portion, council members are not permitted to engage in a dialogue or discussion with the presenter. That's the way it's done in practice. It just formalizes it a little bit more. Getting back to 215, under what was part B as in boy, now it would be D as in dog. It has the language regarding a walk-in item. On your copy, it's showing deleted. I don't want to say one way or the other if we should delete it entirely, but for your information, I mean, the Open Meetings Commission and also the South Dakota Municipal Attorneys Association, we have been concerned for quite a long time in terms of walk-in items and items that are taken action the same night they're walked in terms of how that correlates with the 24-hour notice provision. I mean, there are times when something may need to be walked in. I think with the Monday versus the Tuesday, having the 24 hours in advance allows for most of the items that would have come in as a walk-in to be handled that route. But there still be, excuse me, the rare occasion when you may need to walk something in. The municipal attorneys, we've been fairly comfortable with a first reading of an ordinance coming, say, as a walk-in, because the public wouldn't have a chance to allow their input into that until the second reading anyway. But for any other item requiring action, the municipal attorneys are very uncomfortable with any of our respective clients walking items in, especially with the 24-hour notice provision. So I just put that in there just as a deletion. Just not to mean that that's the way you should go, but I think that needs to be tweaked somehow so that we can address that problem, yet understand that there are times when things happen and we may need to do it at the last minute. 2-23, and I appreciate your indulgence here. I'll move quickly. 223, subpart B as in boy, just tweaking that a little bit so that the sponsor of a proposed ordinance or other legislation would provide either a written or an oral explanation to the City Council. And certainly there are times when, say like this committee meeting right now, an oral explanation is being provided. It's going to be on video forever, and it provides the explanation and the reasoning behind the changes. Otherwise, there should be probably a memo just to explain it further, because I know you as council members are studying the legislation over several days or weeks prior to when it's actually up on the agenda. And there are times when you want to go back and look one last time. Say, I know a lot of you work over the weekend to review the items for tonight, and that's very common, and a memo would be helpful if you haven't had that oral explanation. And I know Sue Roust was talking about how the county, that's the way it's done, is you have a memo explaining the legislation in advance so that the county commissioners can study that in advance of their vote on it. I think that's most of the main changes, other than, 2-35, in terms of the executive orders. This is at the request of the clerk's office, that those be maintained on Insight. All the employees have access to Insight. They're also maintained by the Human Resources Office, and any of the public can get copies of them if they want. And the clerk's office has requested that they not be required to also keep a copy, since they're readily available by other means. So thank you for your indulgence.
Thank you. Do we have anything to add there?
Very quickly, I would just add a few more points. Thank you. One thing this will do is it will provide more consistency in your meeting date. In 2012, there are 7 Monday holidays. You already meet on Tuesday on those weeks. And there are very few Tuesday holidays in a year. And so that's one thing I think this helps. I think that these changes will cut duplication and increase efficiencies, and some of the ones not directly attached to the changing to a Tuesday night were ones that I suggested after observing how things run in the office and seeing how we could make them move more quickly and be more responsive. This does move, it gives in both directions. It moves the deadline 4 hours later in the day, but it also moves the public release of the agenda later in the week. Still well within deadlines. I think it gives people the same access. It gives the council the same full weekend plus a day now to look at agenda items that they do now. One benefit I see from releasing the public agenda and attachments later is that we frequently will have an attachment, say a PowerPoint presentation, and then late in the week the department contacts us and says, oh, we've had to make a change. And then since it's already been publicly released, we put out a new version but don't take down the old version that was originally there. I think that leads to confusion from citizens who might see 5 or 6 attachments. As far as downsides, there was some concern expressed when this was presented to the department directors on Thursday about the no walk-in feature. There are some of them that would like it to still be there. Attorney Fifley's response at last Thursday's meeting was, it's always possible for the mayor to declare an emergency or for you to call a special meeting for something that truly is an emergency and that you couldn't get in. But that's really a policy for the council to decide. One other thing, just a note on behalf of my staff, there is some concern that election days are Tuesdays. And so you may end up with council meetings scheduled for an election day, which, frankly, council staff will be a little bit busy, and some of you might be, because some of you might be on the ballot and not interested in being here at 7 p.m. rather than watching election returns. You always have the ability to reschedule a meeting, should you wish. And if this is approved, you might look at what you do with your April meeting, your April 10th meeting next year. If this is moved forward by this committee today, it could potentially, if approved by the council, take effect for the first meeting in February of 2012.
Thank you. Any questions from the committee members? Councilman Urfenbach?
Where do I begin? Either one of you, and I know that you both know that I support moving to Tuesdays. I think there's some real value in it from consistency standpoint. There's some real value in terms of that whole really rigid deadline. We've talked about that over and over again. In terms of, I think we're going to let the public know in plenty of time and still allow. The biggest point for me has been that PowerPoint thing. When there's 7 PowerPoints on there and you don't know which one you're supposed to refer to, it's ridiculous. And so I appreciate us thinking sort of beyond that. So first, a statement. I am, as a council member, not going to support changing the time. It's not just about the public being able to attend, but it is about the good employers of Sioux Falls who block web streaming on their computers. I can't watch council meetings at work. That's not okay in the private sector. And so I think this is commonly a pretty open time for folks, whether it's a Monday night or Tuesday night. I think that the timing is important to keep it the way that it is. And I think that it would preclude more people from being on council if it were earlier in the day. I think that for me is a real issue in terms of my own employment. And so I would appreciate that we consider keeping it this late in the day. Then first question is, do we have Robert's rules as our Like, is it in ordinance that we use Robert's Rules of Order? It is. I'm seeing the nods. Okay, thank you. And then I have specific questions about changes in, if I might, Mr. Chair, about specific changes in the, starting in section 215. Find it. Subsection B. Hold on. The last sentence, removing an item from the consent agenda to the regular agenda to merely ask a few questions or gather background information is not necessary and should be discouraged. I feel like I've just been slapped on the hand when I read that. Thanks, Attorney Pfeiffer. I would respectfully, because the consent agenda is a format that's used in public bodies in a lot of ways, I would respectfully ask that we strike that sentence and continue with that sort of general agreement, sort of a ladies and gentlemen's agreement that if there is a consent agenda item that you have questions about, that you would ask about it, and if you're going to pull it, you will pull it. You know, we'll let directors know ahead of time that you're going to pull it, so somebody would be here to answer questions. I think that's fair and follows sort of common practices. I'll let the committee kind of decide on that, but if I can just throw all these out there, then I'll be quiet. On subsection C, then, right under that 215 subsection C, I would prefer, instead of, the bottom part of that paragraph talks about the walk-ins, and it talks about, it allows a walk-in by a vote of majority of the city council members present. And currently, to get a walk-in, you have to have 6 votes.
This is really not a walk-in anymore.
Okay.
This is something put in time so that we can give 24-hour notice to the public.
Okay.
And in that notice to the public, it would be listed at the end of the agenda under the section items added after agenda deadline with a notice that this would not be considered at the meeting unless it received a majority vote to be added to the calendar. So that's our distinction.
Okay.
We have such a strict rule for walk-ins because we aren't properly noticing them to the public, so we want a very high standard for those.
Right. So I'm interpreting walk-in broader than that. Okay. Okay. That makes sense to me then. I understand that. And then you're saying, Attorney Pfeiffer, that the walk-in, the 6-vote thing is up for debate, basically, in subsection D under that, right? You have stricken that part out of the new subsection D. Right?
Correct.
And so it's still up for debate. I really like the 6 votes for walk-ins. But I've already been pretty well chastised about that, too. So then if I might, just 2 more.
No chastisement intended,
Thank you.
I assure you.
Thank you.
That other one, I'm sorry, go ahead.
If I might, just 216A, then subsection A. I wonder if the committee might consider latitude there when it comes to, you know, we allow folks 5 minutes at the podium for that public input section, and that is in ordinance. But then if a person has come to give input on an item that's on the agenda, we require that they wait until, and this is very strict, that they wait until that item appears on the agenda in order to speak to it. If there is a scheduling conflict, especially given what we're talking about with Tuesday nights in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, can we give some leeway to those folks who can get here for 7 o'clock but really need to be someplace at 7:30? They'd like to give input on item 27, but they're not going to be available for item 27. Do you understand what I'm saying? I think we need to think about some leeway there. And we've done it in practice. If, you know, somebody comes in and they say to the mayor, you know what, I've got something I have to be at later, can I speak at public input? Very likely the mayor says, yes, absolutely, do it for this one thing. I just think there might be a way to work that. I don't know what the wording is. And then my last one is subsection 223, I guess, section 223. Subsection C. Is that right? My notes aren't right now.
C or E? The one that's crossed out, is that the one you're asking about?
Well, I was taking very quick notes as he was talking. I'm talking about, I may have to find this later. So my note says directors, question mark, 223.
223B is the one that talked about the sponsor of proposed legislation providing written or oral explanation at least 24 hours prior to the meeting.
Yeah, no, I didn't have any problem with that. I apologize, I don't remember what my scratchings mean, and it wasn't as important as I probably thought it was at the time. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're very welcome. Councilor Aguilar?
I would agree with, I don't like that last line in B, section 215. I would like to see that stricken before it goes to the council as a whole. And I would agree with any changes that they have 6 votes rather than just a majority.
But if
And-
are you okay with that idea, if they've gotten it in 24 hours in advance, that it's just the majority of the people attending? That's what C is under that. That's
But it would already have been posted, right?
Currently, if an item gets in by deadline, all it needs is 2 council members
To sign it.
to sign it. Now we're saying we're really adding another level
Okay.
between the original deadline and the walk-ins. That one, in time to give full public notice.
Okay, then I'm fine with it, I guess.
You
If,
That would just
But
be a
anything-
majority vote then, right?
Majority of those present is the way this is written. You know, you could say a majority of the council if you wanted.
and I'd like to keep the deletion of the walk-ins just for the discussion, because I would be in favor of not allowing them.
I think it would have to be a very special circumstance at that point for a walk-in, if we've given them a couple levels and given them that extended time to be able to get an agenda item in.
And with the public input, couldn't that just be left up to the discretion of the presiding officer? I mean, I think that by Roberts you can do that, can't you? So we don't really even have to put that part in. The presiding officer would have that discretion. Am I right or am I wrong?
They certainly would, Councilor Aguilar, that's right.
So I don't think we need to change.
I guess my concern on that is the flow of the actual council meeting also, that we're jumping around from one agenda item to another. And I think that's where we could get in trouble by allowing people to come in and address an agenda item before that item actually comes up. If you have somebody like that, maybe we have to look at amending our agenda to move that item up or down, however, to address that issue.
Yeah, that makes sense to me, too. I just don't want to start legislating some of this if we don't have to, because there is enough flexibility in Roberts at times for the presiding officer to make some of those decisions.
Okay. Any other comments, questions? Questions from other council members?
As long as we're here and we've been listening, I think a lot of your comments have been great. If I could go through a couple that I thought, the Tuesday is no problem for a small business owner myself, and I think some of the comments that Sue brought up make sense with making it easier and everything she said. Problems I had were the questions with Section 2-9, presiding officer duties, the D, removing the parliamentary for meetings at the council. I just feel like somebody needs to be in charge. There needs to be a strict adherence to the code of how meetings are proceeded. I've sat here enough times where something happened, we weren't sure what was the right answer, and if it turns into the body deciding what the real right answer is, I think it's just a little chaos. It's just a lot easier to follow Robert's rules and not a live or die thing for me, but I just think it helps control order during the meeting. The other topic was allowing a walk-in item. I still like the idea of the council having the authority to do that. Maybe it's not written exactly right as it is today, but I still like the authority of the council to be able to bring in an item. That was section 215D, I think it is.
Councilman Jameson, on that, you still agree with the 6 votes
Yes.
for a walk-in then?
Yes.
Okay.
I know there's other provisions for the mayor to call an emergency or for us to call for a special meeting, but I don't know that we've really exercised that up as much, of bringing in a special item, but I still like the idea of the council having that ability. You know, the elections that occur in our city on a Tuesday night, very good point, didn't think of that, but I still think it's still worth moving to Tuesdays. It's, from what I can gather, there's a lot of efficiencies, and so those are just some thoughts.
Thank you. Any other comments from public?
Can I just briefly respond to Councilor Jameson's comments about the parliamentarian issue? This is my fault. This is the one that I brought forward on just a straight reading of the ordinance. At the time I made this suggestion, I did not realize that this had just been put in place in July. I was very surprised to see that it was specified that the city clerk should act as parliamentarian. Just a couple comments on that. I find that very unusual. First of all, a parliamentarian is never the one that rules on an item. The parliamentarian advises the presiding officer. It's the presiding officer who rules on any questions. As a practical matter, we work very closely with the city attorney. Just as an example, we had an issue that was to come before you a couple of weeks ago on a joint Lincoln County, City of Sioux Falls item. When my staff saw it, they raised questions and said, as you know, according to Roberts, is this the way we can really do it? We didn't make a ruling on it. We contacted the state's attorney, asked them about it. They did a little bit of research and came up with a final recommendation to the council. That's the way we work. And I just feel that stating in ordinance that a particular official is to be your parliamentarian is, as I said, a little unusual. I know some of my staff are a little concerned about it as well, because if they're focused on taking minutes and all of a sudden they get asked a parliamentary question right in the middle of what they're doing, it really puts the pressure on them, and that's a case where we would refer it to the city attorney. And so that suggestion comes from me, and just wanted to explain my reasoning behind it.
Would that be something that we could look at rewording a little bit? Because in my experiences in our council meetings, when we've had those type of issues, that's just exactly how you explained it is how it's worked, where we've asked the chief city clerk or our clerks to give us Robert's rules, and then they've worked with the city attorney. Usually he's reaching back for his book about that time. So I think maybe just rewording that a little bit would be able to resolve that issue.
Either we could, or, I mean, that's the way it works under Robert's rules, is the chair has the right to refer, to appoint anyone they want as the parliamentarian, to refer to anyone, but the final decision is with the chair.
Thank you. Okay. On this now, this would take a vote to move this to the city council, or do we have any other motions or on this issue?
You know, Mr. Chair, if I might, I think it would be good for us to move it forward so it goes to first reading. We can work out some of these details. I think we're hearing just in general conversation that we're pretty much as a council okay with it. We just have some details to work with. I'd like to see it happen sooner rather than later, so I'd really like it to go forward. I'd make that motion.
And I would second that. Can I ask a question then?
Please.
So then are you saying move it forward with no change?
No, I'm not saying move it forward with no change. I'm saying move it forward with the suggested changes that we've put forward now, and that we would see it, you know, in first reading with some of those changes, and perhaps in consultation between leadership and the city attorney and city clerk, we might be able to iron some of those details out.
And maybe is this something we might want to see at an informational before
Yes,
we
there's a
actually
good
bring
idea,
it to
yeah.
the council meeting also?
Would that,
So
That
it's-
makes sense.
don't you think?
Okay.
I like that.
All right. With the motion made, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
That passes 3-0. That will move on to our council. Item number 6, open discussion. Do we have anything for open discussion today? Okay, then I need a motion for adjournment, please.
So moved.
Second, Erpenbach.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
This meeting is adjourned.